Man, everybody knows about The Evil Dead, that crazy little independent horror movie that was made for like $375, and somehow it became one of the most influential horror movies ever created. It launched the careers of director Sam Raimi, producer Robert Tapert, and of course, the now famous and crowd-beloved Bruce Campbell. And Bruce Campbell would eventually become one of horror's biggest icons. But what if I told you that after all of that success, there almost wasn't an Evil Dead 2? Not because the audience didn't want one, but truthfully, it was because Sam Raimi himself wasn't even sure that he wanted to make another horror movie. The original film had pushed everybody involved to their absolute breaking point. I mean, the cast froze inside of a cabin for weeks, crew members were sleeping on the floor, they didn't have water, the prosthetics and makeup were absolutely god-awful to wear, money consistently ran out, and Bruce Campbell was taking so many accidental hits to the face that he jokingly said in multiple interviews that he earned every single dollar of his paycheck through his pain. And by the time the filming wrapped, everybody was overly exhausted. But because the film had become such a cultural hit, naturally, of course, Hollywood's next answer was do it again, but this time make it bigger, make it gorier. And somehow, against all odds, that's exactly what happened. Now, we already went through the history of the first Evil Dead movie, but now is the time to discuss my favorite installment in the franchise. This is the history of Evil Dead 2. When the first Evil Dead premiered in 1981, bro, nobody, and I mean literally nobody, expected it to become the massive cultural hit that it became. Hell, not even the people involved with the movie thought this. It wasn't released by a major studio and it didn't have any recognizable actors. It was just a dream of three childhood friends from Michigan who refused to let a lack of money stop them from making movies. And this worked very well for them. The movie became an underground sensation. Critics praised its creativity, while other critics called it a little amateurish and didn't think that it was really that great. However, like I said in the last video, Stephen King famously championed the film after seeing it at a film festival, and he helped it to gain further attention. The home video market exploded during the early 80s, and The Evil Dead quickly became one of the most rented horror movies on VHS. Its reputation continued growing every single year, and by the mid-80s, Sam Raimi had officially arrived. Well, sort of. Let me explain. Because despite creating one of horror's biggest cult classics, he wasn't exactly swimming in Hollywood money. In fact, his very next project truly proved just how difficult success in Hollywood really is, because Crimewave nearly ended everything. Instead of jumping directly into another horror movie, Sam Raimi wanted to prove that he could create something different. So he teamed up with none other than Joel and Ethan Coen. And Joel and Ethan are famously known as the Coen brothers, who would eventually later direct films like Fargo, No Country for Old Men, and The Big Lebowski. And together they created a bizarre slapstick crime comedy called Crimewave. But unfortunately, almost nothing went according to plan. Studio executives consistently interfered with Sam Raimi's vision. The film was heavily re-edited without his approval. Multiple scenes were removed, the pacing changed, and the final product barely resembled the movie that Sam wanted to make. And then to make matters worse, it bombed, like terribly. The reviews, brutal. The box office, way worse. And for the first time in his very early career, Sam Raimi started to question whether or not Hollywood was even interested in the kind of movies that he was interested in making. But ironically, the very thing that he was trying to escape from ended up being the very thing that saved his career, the horror genre. But not just the horror genre, more specifically, his baby, the Evil Dead franchise. But see, the thing with this though is that he couldn't just easily run back to Evil Dead because there were hiccups involved with the situation. Because unfortunately, Sam Raimi no longer had the rights to the original Evil Dead film. Meaning, if he was going to revisit this movie, there was no way that he could use any of the footage that he filmed for the first one, and he couldn't even reference the movie. As a matter of fact, one thing that a lot of people either don't notice or don't really talk about is the fact that if you pay attention to the titles of the film, The Evil Dead has the word "the" in it, but Evil Dead 2 dropped the, and that became a trend for the rest of the franchise. As a result, in order for him to do Evil Dead 2, he had to find some very creative workarounds. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding Evil Dead 2 is that it's a remake of the first movie, and you'll hear people say that all the time. Heck, even I say it every now and again. People say stuff like, oh, it's just the first movie all over again, or they say that it's a reboot. And a lot of people say that, oh, they just remade the first one, but this time with more money. But that's actually not what happened. The truth is a lot stranger than that, because like I said, Sam Raimi no longer owned the rights to the first movie. The rights to the footage from the first film were tied up with multiple different companies. And unfortunately, Sam Raimi couldn't just simply copy scenes from the original movie and place them inside the sequel, so audiences needed some kind of refresher, especially because in the 80s, horror movie sequels typically came right after the first movie, but Evil Dead 2 came out nearly half a decade after the first one came out. And in the 80s, that was very unheard of. And by this time, if you didn't already own a VHS copy of The Evil Dead, you probably probably didn't even see it. And this wasn't a TV show, so Sam Raimi couldn't hit you with a big ass sign that said previously on The Evil Dead. He had to do something a little clever. So instead of just showing footage from the first movie, he simply reshot the opening events. And that's why Linda is the only other character that we actually see during the recap, because the rest of the group, Shelly, Scotty, and Cheryl, they're completely absent. Not because they didn't exist, but because Sam Raimi wasn't trying to recreate every single detail. He was simply giving audiences the information they needed before launching into the actual sequel. So once Ash is thrown through the forest by the evil force, everything after that is completely new. So despite what people believed for decades, Evil Dead 2 isn't a remake. It's a sequel that had to creatively work around some legal limitations, and to be perfectly honest, those limitations accidentally created one of horror's biggest myths. Now the next little hiccup when it came to creating Evil Dead 2 came down to a little thing that we love to call money, because finding somebody that was insane enough to finance this movie was a little challenge. But it's Sam Raimi and it's Bruce Campbell. Don't nothing stop them boys. Let's get back to it. Raimi needed money, more money than he'd ever had before, but convincing the investors to fund another splatter horror film wasn't exactly easy, especially after Crimewave. Unfortunately, that movie put a little bit of a stain on his reputation, and investors were like, hey man, that last movie you did was a bunch of dog shit, so I don't know if I want to put my funds into you, my guy. But fret not, because he didn't give up. Sam Raimi eventually got some help from a legendary producer, Dino De Laurentiis. Please forgive me if I mispronounced that name. And the budget increased dramatically. You remember how the last time Sam Raimi made an Evil Dead movie, it went from a $1,600 short film to a $375,000 feature-length production? Well, this time around for Evil Dead 2, my boy Sam Raimi got $3.5 million. Now to him, that felt like unlimited money. My guy never had that kind of bread. But even with those $3.5 million, to Hollywood, that was still chump change. But compared to the original, this was a dream come true. And for the first time, the film crew actually could afford some real good effects. Much larger sets, more elaborate camera rigs, professional makeup this time, actual animatronic and mechanical creatures, and enough fake blood to flood an entire cabin. Sam Raimi finally had all the resources that he needed to make the movie that he really wanted. But the only question now that remains is, could he and the film crew survive going back to that cabin again? And most importantly, could Bruce Campbell handle going through what he went through with the first one again, but this time on a larger scale? Well, let's talk about it. One thing that many people don't realize is that Bruce Campbell wasn't simply just showing up to act anymore. He had become one of the film's executive producers. That means that while he was busy getting thrown against walls and covered in slime and violently attacked by furniture, he was also helping to make sure that the movie actually got finished. Bruce often joked that independent filmmaking basically meant everybody had multiple jobs. One day he'd be acting, and the next day he'd be helping solve production problems, sometimes carrying film equipment, helping to build sets, and sometimes even figuring out where the next day's budget was even going. And that mentality never really disappeared, because even with millions of dollars, the crew still operated like independent filmmakers, which is probably one of the biggest reasons why Evil Dead 2 feels so energetic, because everybody on set was 100% invested. Nobody was just there for a paycheck. This was truly a passion project for everybody involved. They were making the movie because they genuinely loved making movies and because they genuinely believed in this franchise. And that passion practically bleeds through every single frame that you see. With financing finally secure, Sam Raimi and the crew could begin working on what was arguably the biggest project of their careers at the time. But even with the budget that was nearly 10 times bigger than the original one, they still had to be very creative, because again, this is still technically a small budget by Hollywood standards. So they didn't have endless resources. Every single dollar, every single dime, penny, nickel, everything counted. So if something broke on a bigger Hollywood set, they would just replace it, order another one. But in their case, they couldn't do that. If an effect failed, they often had to figure out how to fix it themselves. That DIY mentality had become part of the team's identity, and in retrospect, it may have been their biggest strength. Now, one of the first major decisions that they had to make was figuring out where exactly this movie would be filmed. Now, the original Evil Dead had famously been made in that cabin in Tennessee, and it was a real cabin, an abandoned cabin at that. That cabin honestly had become just as recognizable as Ash himself. But unfortunately, our little cabin had been through some trying times, and I mean trying times like before the film, during, and especially in the years that followed, because after the Evil Dead was filmed there, it still laid there abandoned. And with the Evil Dead being such a massive cult hit, naturally, when fans found the address to the cabin, they flocked there. And what happens when you get a bunch of foot traffic in an already depleting situation? Damages will occur. Years had passed, so the original location had began to deteriorate, and production demanded much more control than a real cabin in the middle of nowhere. So instead, the crew had to literally build an entire new cabin. Most of the interior was constructed on sound stages in North Carolina, which allowed Raimi to remove walls, ceilings, and even entire sections of the set whenever a complicated camera move required it. That flexibility would become one of the film's greatest advantages. Because if you've never watched The Evil Dead 2, you'll notice something almost immediately. The camera never stops moving. One of Sam Raimi's signatures has always been movement, but not just people moving, the camera moving itself. During the original Evil Dead, Raimi and Bruce Campbell famously invented what they jokingly called the shaky cam. With almost no money available for professional equipment, they literally had to mount a camera onto a long wooden beam and had 2 crew members sprint through the woods carrying it. And the result became one of the most recognizable camera techniques in all of horror history. That low-flying point of view became the visual identity of the unseen evil force. And by the time Evil Dead 2 came around, Sam Raimi really wanted to push that idea even further. Now armed with a much bigger budget, the crew built custom rigs, cables, tracks, and elaborate pulley systems to send the camera crashing through windows, flying over furniture, even had the camera busting through doors, and of course, racing through the forest at incredible speeds. Now some shots did require dozens of people working together for perfect timing. Others involved literally destroying parts of the cabin just so the camera could continue moving uninterrupted. Now today, those type of camera shots can be done much quicker, much easier, and way cheaper, and for a lot less labor, because we have drones, we got CGI and stuff like that now. But back then they had to do everything by hand. This was still 100% practical effects, and a little insanity, because they had to be willing to risk damaging some of this film equipment just to get those shots pulled off. And the result gave Evil Dead 2 a sense of chaos and speed that audiences haven't really seen before in the horror genre. The camera no longer acted like a window to this world. The camera literally became the world itself, almost like the camera was possessed. Now when it comes to horror movies, you always need a star. Sometimes the star is the killer, sometimes it's the final girl. But in the case of Evil Dead, there was no final girl. We had a final boy, and that boy was Ash Williams. Now Ash did survive the events of the first Evil Dead, but if you've seen Evil Dead 2, then you know that there was a major difference between those 2 Ashes. A difference so big that it almost seems like they were 2 completely different characters. And besides the budget being much bigger, the first Evil Dead was a very serious yet still campy horror movie, but the horror was the main forefront. This time around, Sam Raimi and the crew decided to do something a little different, and that was add comedy into it. Evil Dead 2 became the staple for slapstick horror comedies. But if you're gonna change the tone of the movie that much, that means you also have to change the tone of our main character. Ash couldn't be the chicken shit scared guy that he was in the first Evil Dead. He had to be a wisecracking, almost comic book hero type character. And with that change, Evil Dead 2 became the movie that gave us the real Ash Williams. Now, like I said, if you was to compare the Ash from the first movie to the Ash that everybody knows now, they're like 2 completely different characters, bro. In the first one, he was a lot more quiet and reserved, and he was low-key a little awkward. He was essentially just an ordinary guy trying to survive an impossible situation. But during the production of the sequel, Sam Raimi realized something very important, is that Bruce Campbell was incredibly talented when it came to physical comedy. And by physical comedy, I don't mean just funny dialogue. I mean like silent film level comedy, where there were no words, and it was all about his exaggerated facial expression, his dramatic reactions, and the way that he would literally throw himself across a room. It reminded Raimi a lot of classic performers like Buster Keaton and the Three Stooges. And instead of fighting that silly and goofy ass energy, he basically just embraced it, and Ash suddenly became louder, more expressive, a hell of a lot more cockier. Even while suffering unimaginable pain, he somehow remained extremely entertaining and funny as hell. And this decision completely transformed the franchise. And without Evil Dead 2, there would be no chainsaw, there would be no one-liners, and we wouldn't have the iconic look that we know of Ash today. And even though the sequel to Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, is really where Ash fully became his character, without Evil Dead 2, that would have never happened. Bruce Campbell's portrayal of Ash Williams in Evil Dead 2 was so iconic that he gave us one of the most memorable quotes of the entire 1980s with literally just one word: groovy. But of course, a slapstick horror comedy was not exempt from some painful situations. And I mean physically painful, by the way. Bruce Campbell has spent decades joking that Sam Raimi's favorite special effect was hurting him. And honestly, when you look at Evil Dead 2, it's kind of hard to argue that otherwise, because throughout production, Bruce was slammed into walls, dragged across floors, hit with fake tree branches, and sometimes real tree branches, covered in gallons of slime and fake blood. He was buried underneath furniture, repeatedly tossed all over the place, and many of those stunts, if not all of them, were performed by Bruce himself, because sometimes there was not enough money for a stunt double. And even if there was money for a stunt double, Bruce actually insisted on doing the stunts himself. One extra brutal scene required him to repeatedly smack himself against shelves while pretending that an invisible demon was attacking him. Another one involved being yanked violently across the room using hidden wires, and if the timing was even slightly off, he would slam directly into real furniture. And this happened on multiple occasions. Bruce often described filming Evil Dead 2 as spending several months inside of a live action cartoon. He said everything hurt every single day, yet somehow his physical commitment became one of the film's greatest strengths, and audiences believed every single bruise they saw on screen. Let's be honest, most of those bruises were real. Like, he genuinely got his ass whooped making this movie, bro. Now, one of the things that makes the Evil Dead franchise so iconic is how wacky it is. I mean, we're talking about literal hellspawn demons that like crack jokes and say some of the most inappropriate lines that you've ever heard in a horror movie. And now that they have more money, they could take that wackiness to a whole nother level. And one of the most iconic and wackiest scenes in Evil Dead 2 came completely out of left field and took everybody by surprise. And it might be one of the most famous scenes in the movie, but did you know that that scene almost didn't happen? Let's talk about it a little bit. In Evil Dead 2, Ash was getting taunted by literally everything. The forest itself, the cabin was going crazy, and he had deadites trying to kill him. But there was another very taunting character in the movie that became one of the most iconic characters in the film, and that character was a mounted deer head above the fireplace. In the movie, Ash tried to resist it until eventually he completely lost his mind and started laughing with them, and it's easily one of the most iconic scenes in the whole franchise. But making that scene was unbelievably difficult because nearly every single object in that room during that scene required its own separate practical effect. The deer head was operated using puppetry and of course stop motion. The lamp had mechanical rigs that were attached underneath the table. The furniture was manipulated using wires that were literally this close to being in frame. The stop motion effects made things a little bit easier, but there were some effects that had to rely on perfectly synchronized timing. And I mean so perfect that even if it was off by like a half a second, it would have screwed the entire shot up. Now, of course, it's an Evil Dead movie. That means that Ash Williams isn't the only star of the show, because one of the most important aspects of an Evil Dead movie, of course, my friends, are the deadites. And every Evil Dead movie needs an unforgettable deadite, you know what I'm saying? Like in the first one, we had the deadite that was in the freaking basement, you know, slamming his head up against the thing. That deadite was so iconic that they brought it back in Evil Dead 2013. And Evil Dead 2 introduced us to one of the most iconic and strangest deadites of the entire franchise. And that deadite was Henrietta Nobi, the grotesque, disgusting, cellar-dwelling wife of Professor Raymond Nobi, who is the man that is responsible for bringing the Necronomicon to the cabin in the first place. The character went through multiple different forms during the film, each requiring hours of prosthetic application. The performance itself came from a combination of actors depending on the scene, including Sam Raimi's own brother, Ted Raimi, who endured long sessions buried underneath layers of latex, foam appliances, and heavy makeup. The costume was extremely hot as expected, restrictive, and incredibly uncomfortable. Now, by the midpoint of the film, Ash had endured more punishment than almost every horror main character up to this point. His old lady became a deadite. The woods themselves were alive trying to kill him. The furniture was mocking him. That's screwed up, bro. Imagine getting laughed at by a sofa. That's some bullshit. And his own sanity was literally hanging by a thread. But then Sam Raimi had a sick idea. He said, hey, what if Ash became possessed? But not all of Ash, just his hand. Yeah, a possessed hand became one of the most iconic moments in the Evil Dead franchise. As silly as him chopping off his own hand was, that little part was needed because that's the part that gave Ash his iconic look. Now, after months of filming, countless practical effects, and more physical abuse inflicted on my boy Bruce Campbell than what probably should have been legal, Evil Dead 2 was finally complete. The film did premiere in 1987, and critics noticed something different almost immediately. Unlike many horror sequels that were literally just rehashings of the first one with hardly any originality, Evil Dead 2 basically reinvented itself. Some reviewers called it one of the funniest horror movies of all time. Others praised its visual creativity, and many others couldn't believe how much personality was squeezed into such a small budget. Even though to Sam Raimi, $3.5 million was not a small budget. And if you look at the review scores, you will see that Evil Dead 2 has historically been more praised than the first one. But critical praise did not automatically create financial success. The movie earned just under $6 million, which was decent, I guess, because it did make its budget back. But based on everything they put into the movie and how good the movie was, they definitely deserve more. Thankfully though, more is exactly what they got, because there was this little thing called the VHS market. Just like the original film, Evil Dead 2 found its true audience at home. Video rental stores became its natural habitat. College students were introducing roommates to it. Horror fans watched it over and over and over again, and with every passing year, its reputation only grew stronger. And eventually, Evil Dead 2 wasn't simply considered a good sequel. Many fans began calling it the greatest horror sequel ever made. And there's actually a strong argument for that, because very few sequels completely redefined their franchise while simultaneously improving on nearly every aspect of the original. And Evil Dead 2 somehow managed to do both. Now today, it's almost impossible to measure just how influential Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2 truly became, filmmakers across multiple generations have cited how Sam Raimi's kinetic camera work and inventive practical styles and his fearless blend of horror and comedy as major inspirations. And you can see echoes of its style in everything from zombie films to action comedies. And the execution of this film helped to redefine what low-budget filmmakers believed was possible. And more importantly, it proved something that every independent filmmaker needed to hear. And it's that money does help, but imagination always matters more. Because Sam Raimi didn't become legendary because he had the biggest budget. He became legendary because despite every single limitation that he and his crew had, they somehow always made it work. They didn't let what they couldn't afford stop them. All he simply asked was, well, we can't afford that, how else can we do it? And that mindset changed not only his career, but also the horror genre itself forever. And it's funny because when people talk about Evil Dead 2, they usually remember the chainsaw and the shotgun and how funny it was. But outside of all of that, Evil Dead 2 is really a story about perseverance. A director coming off of a career disappointment and a group of lifelong friends refusing to quit. It was about an actor who was willing to damn near kill himself to get this movie off. Without Evil Dead 2, there would be no Army of Darkness, and there would be no Evil Dead Rise or Evil Dead Burn or Evil Dead 2013. There wouldn't have been the comics or any of that other stuff. And truth be told, without Evil Dead 2, there probably would have been no Spider-Man trilogy, because Sam Raimi probably would have never recovered his career if this movie failed. And as a result, Evil Dead 2 isn't just one of the greatest horror sequels of all time, it is literally one of the greatest horror movies in general of all time. Well, that concludes today's deep dive into my favorite film in the Evil Dead franchise, Evil Dead 2. I really hope you enjoyed yourself. If you stayed this long, I really appreciate you. And don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button, drop a comment below, and stay tuned for the next one, because next time we'll be taking a look at how Ash Williams was thrown back into the Middle Ages in one of the wildest tonal shifts that horror has ever seen. So y'all stay tuned for the history of Army of Darkness. Y'all be smooth, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.